This program is made possible in part by funds provided by Nebraskans for Public Television. The Nebraska ETV Network presents the Sheldon Film Theater. Tonight, In the Year of the Pig by Emile D'Antonio. Your host is June Perry Levine.
Good evening. Welcome to the Sheldon Film Theater. Tonight's film is In the Year of the Pig, an influential documentary about the struggle in Vietnam. It was made in 1969 by Emile D'Antonio, who is with us this evening. Mr. D'Antonio is a leading American documentarian whose films include Point of Order, a film about the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, Rush to Judgment, whose subject is the investigation of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Millhouse, a white comedy about Richard Nixon, Painter's Painting, a study of avant-garde artists in New York, and Underground, on the Weather Underground organization. We will talk with Mr. D'Antonio at length about In the Year of the Pig following the film. But first, a preliminary question. D. In the Year of the Pig is an analysis of Vietnam, beginning with the French colonial period and extending up until the late 60s at the time that the film was edited. What is the relevance of the film today?
Well, I think anything that works for more than the time in which it's made, just arbitrarily. But I don't think it has any precise relationship. I don't believe any work that is made at time A ever has a precise relationship to subsequent time. It only has a general relationship. But I would say that that general relationship is still the initiative that our government keeps presenting to the world in efforts to impose our will over certain parts of the world. I would say that the struggles going on for liberation in Central America and that will eventually break out in South America do have an analogous relationship to the war in Vietnam and to the folly. You cannot win those wars without exterminating the people, because the people don't really want us. They don't want the Russians either, for that matter. They want to be liberated. They want to be the rulers of El Salvador. And they don't want colonels whom we own, and they don't want us. And the same thing is true in Nicaragua, and it's going to be true in Honduras, and it's going to be true again in Guatemala, where we overturn the government. And this is a history, the film does constitute a tragic history of the folly of imperial ambition. And which this film was finished in 1968, and yet it clearly foreshadowed our defeat in Vietnam, and we were defeated there. We didn't pull out, we didn't quit, we were defeated. And so that's the lesson. If you look at it, you can see very clearly that when people are determined not to be overrun by another power, that indeed they succeed. And the Russians have not overrun Vietnam, and obviously the Chinese have not, all the things that our presidents predicted. In fact, anybody who studied the history of Vietnam knew that Vietnam and China, long before the word communism was, 2,000 years before the word communism was used, that those countries were historically enemies. So, you know, that's, whatever small lesson that's there, there it is.
Thanks. And now, In the Year of the Pig. Since your film is clearly an advocacy film, and one of the positions that it advocates is the disengagement of the American war machine, did you find that people's response to the film was largely determined by their own positions on that controversial subject?
Well, I think when you make advocacy films, that there's no doubt that you at once have a natural constituency of the people who share your point of view. At the same time, the purpose of this film was to change other people's minds, and it did. I know it did in a very hard, concrete way, and that many, many people have written to me, have stopped me on the street, have come up to me and have said, you know, I was just doing this thing, or I was going to college or something, and I saw your film, and I started thinking, because the film really, if all my work has a subject, it's the history of the country in which I live. And as you pointed out in an earlier conversation, you know, I don't think that history is Kleenex. It's not a disposable item. You put it to your nose and chuck it out. But history has to be recaptured. History dies unless we recapture it. And the point of my work is to recapture that history and try to make, even no matter how impermanent our lives are, to capture that work and make it slightly permanent, at least, on film. And, you know, this film was made really a long time ago. I started the film in early '67, and that's a long, long time ago, and yet it still plays. We just saw it here tonight. And it plays all over the world. It's going to be on national television in London in 2 months, for the third play, actually, in England.
Well, your film presents an analysis of the factors in our involvement. And in many ways, it's much more intellectual than a great deal else that has been written or filmed about Vietnam, because it really develops a complex argument through the selection and arrangement of the details. You were speaking about the effect that the film had on people who saw it. Do you think that this rational discourse that you follow is the most effective way to change people's minds, or is it simply a mode that's congenial to you in expressing yourself?
Oh, you know, I tend to say both to questions like that. Obviously, the mode is congenial to me. It's the way in which I work. I'm an intellectual. I can't help that. It's a bad word. But this is who I am, and I couldn't change that for anything. But I don't think there's any stronger way. I mean, we are a media people. I don't like to consider my work media, and yet they are, whether I choose to think of them as such or not. I still think that film is probably the most powerful way of presenting ideas to people, because we don't really read the way we used to. I read 200 books preparing myself for this film, concerning the French history of the struggle and concerning our own history in Vietnam. But the average person isn't about to do that, nor should he, I suppose. And I believe that there are epiphanic moments in films which stand for volumes of history. I think that in this film, for instance, those sequences which I intercut of the 4 Vietnamese rickshaw drivers pulling the French in their elegant white suits and pith helmets, and then being discarded like that, being told to leave the cafe, intercut with the French Foreign Legion, and under which I've laid a soundtrack of von Suppé's light cavalry overture, I mean, which is a mockery of military in general, as well as specifically here. I think that that very short sequence of a couple of minutes sums up precisely what the colonial experience is. Yellow men are pulling white men, and when the white men are done, the yellow men are sent away. That could be almost a definition of colonialism. And yet it's much more powerful than my saying it, or than anybody reading it.
You don't like to use a narrator in your films, I know that. And therefore, the ways that you explain your ideas, such as in the sequence you were talking about right now, and I presume you don't like to use a narrator because you like to have people participate more actively rather than passively receiving a lot of explanation. So you use the editing of the images, or the editing of the images and the sound, you're saying, in order to make the observations. And I can think of examples of this in the film. When Jean Lacouture speaks about Ho Chi Minh's dedicated nationalism, you run this over pictures of the Vietnamese landscape, and therefore you seem to be connecting Ho to, of course, the people and the land. Or, for example, when Senator Morton says that Ho is the George Washington of Vietnam, you show signs, as I recall, of Shell, Standard Oil, American Syndicate. And that indicates what Ho's revolution is against, but it also parallels it's something with our own revolution against colonialism.
Taxation without representation is finally the equivalent of Shell and Mobil.
Right. Another kind of way that this is done is General Westmoreland says that our soldiers understand what they are fighting for, and you cut then to John Towler, the Green Beret deserter, saying that the soldiers don't understand. They only can deal with the gun or with money, and they despise the people. Now, these are all ways that the sound image or the cut from shot to shot make the points. Could you think of some others that perhaps some of us have missed in which the meaning is only clear by seeing the editing montage?
No, I don't think I would ever point out to anybody what she or he has missed. I mean, if they've missed it, they've missed it. And it would be improper for me to try to guess what a theoretical audience may or may not have missed. I mean, I'm against narration for a variety of reasons. First of all, there's something that is so eminently phony to me about that lordly, godlike voice that tells the audience what it is looking at while it's looking at it, that I find, to me, personally, morally and aesthetically repellent in the extreme. The other thing is I like to tell stories, and my films are documentaries, but in a sense, my film tells the story. It is a story film in the sense that it is the history of the French, not all of the history, but then a fiction film isn't all of the history, say, of a love affair between two people, or of a fiction film about war, or the burning of a plantation in Georgia, or Charlie Chaplin in Alaska, or in the gold rush, or whatever it is. I mean, I'm telling a story which is intrinsically and organically constructed filmically so that it doesn't need this outside voice. I don't need that plummy voice going on about what went on the screen, because the screen itself and the soundtrack do this. And I like to think that from time to time I engage in somewhat subtle touches, in some cases very broad touches, because I have different feelings about what goes on in the screen. I know that a lot of people who had fought in Vietnam were very angry with me because in a sequence that had something to do with search and destroy, there's a Marine Corps colonel, a young, rather good-looking man, standing there smiling, and the village is being burned, and old women are crawling away, and there's an expression of a woman in fear and terror, and then you're back to that colonel. And people have said to me, those images didn't really occur that way. My answer to that is it makes no difference if they really occurred that way, because they did occur that way in a moral sense. But then I end up by saying, in fact, those images did happen precisely that way. It's that we were conditioned to believe that they could not happen that way, so that we chose not to believe that those images happened that way, but indeed they did. The film is also personal. All my work is personal. I think that people make films, not machines. And that film is full of the film that we saw is full of personal references to my own life. There's a statue of a member of the 163rd Pennsylvania Infantry, which fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, General Meade against General Lee, 1863. I happened to, that was almost 100 years before our war was escalated. I happen to have admired that battle and to have felt strongly. Hemingway once said that he regretted that he lived in the United States after the Civil War, because that there was that moment was the great moment. And I think that he was right, because I think that in spite of the economic reasons and causes of the Civil War, that a great many people fought in it for other reasons, and that the abolitionist movement did have a real and profound influence, which was very similar to the influence of the anti-war people in our war. I mean, that's the kind of vague thing that I don't expect anybody to get. But I don't care, because I think in any work of art, there are these sort of arcane and perhaps in some cases minor elements that are buried under the very texture of the work. The main part of the work is surely clear enough, but there are also those other little private things that are mine, and that some people will find and others won't. The ones who will never find them are critics, because critics by nature are thick-skinned, obtuse, and really have an impossible job to do. I mean, most critics have to write these bloody reviews on an almost daily basis or a weekly basis. I think the only reviewer in any art I can think of in the 19th and 20th centuries who really was able to turn out acceptable prose and rational ideas was George Bernard Shaw, under the name Cornetto di Bazzetto, when he did a music review almost every day, and they still hold up. You know, they're just being republished. But that's way off our track of social reality. And
Well, I want to go back to something that you said in that long, varied answer. That even if the footage didn't really happen that way, the colonel with this indifferent or pleasant look and the people scrambling in fear, that it was what was morally happening and that would therefore justify using it that way. Now, obviously that's a fairly controversial statement. There are people who would say that direct cinema, that documentary has got to not tamper, even though we know that almost all film does tamper in television and not. But how can you justify saying that since that is the morality of it, it's all right to put the film in that kind of sequence?
anyone who looks through the eyepiece of a camera is already tampering. Because as she or he looks through that eyepiece, she or he brings to that eyepiece a whole life, a whole existence, a whole artillery of prejudice and assumption about the nature of society, about the nature of what is out there that I'm filming. And more importantly, once we have filmed and we put the film on the editing table and start cutting, we bring to that structure, to that editing, what we feel about anything. I could make an absolutely objective film about my drinking a glass of water, I think, as long as the film were terribly brief, because I don't like water. Maybe I could. I could not make I mean, I had this argument once in Eastern Europe, and somebody said, well, you could surely make an objective film about glass blowing in Czechoslovakia. And I said, don't be ridiculous. That's a very important subject because it's loaded with the following questions: the conditions of work, the conditions of pay, what the workers feel about all the rest of this, what the position of the manager is, what the function of the glassware is when it's finished. Is it to produce almost anything you do, no matter how simple it is? A kiss under documentary conditions brings all of our prejudices to that kiss. Who is kissing? Why are they kissing? Which sexes? For what reason? You know, I mean, objectivity simply doesn't exist. It doesn't even exist, I think, as now the scientists are beginning to admit, in science. And I don't even I'm not sure it exists in mathematics either, because you even choose the equations in advance that you theoretically that you seek for your ultimate solutions. So direct cinema, you know, it's an interesting phrase, but it's not as meaningful as it seems to be. I think that morally I would have had the right to take that Marine Corps colonel, because that is bloody well what that Marine Corps colonel was doing, and have an old Vietnamese woman crawling away from the hole she was hiding in without any of her goods left, because that also was what we were doing there. That was an immoral war on our part, an unjust war, and that war has still torn this country apart because we fought it in the name of a lie. The lie, there were many lies to that war. The greatest of them is, I think, that there were two Vietnams. There weren't two Vietnams. There was one Vietnam, as there is one United States. And the government kept telling the American people year after year that these bought generals, these corrupt whores of generals, were legitimate representatives of the people of Vietnam. Nothing could have been farther from the truth, and that lie finally cost us the defeat, the victory which the Vietnamese people so justly deserved.
A film like yours presents us with an enormous number of people, speakers, I mean, actors in this great drama, and a lot of them people can still recognize because they're governmental leaders, and so they know who they are. But there are some people in this film that I think are rather unknown to us, even though they're Americans in government. I'm thinking, for example, about William Corson, the man who was identified as a Marine Corps colonel and a CIA person who doesn't seem very much like either to me. Could you tell me a little bit about him and the views that he expresses in the film?
I mean, sure. This is exactly the way I make films. As I was finishing In the Year of the Pig, Corson wrote a book. And Corson wrote a book about his life as a CIA agent and as a Marine Corps colonel in Vietnam. He had been present at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He was there as an American observer at the beginning. He was a unique person for that reason. So I just called him up. Now, Corson is one of those people that belongs to our past, in that he doesn't, unlike myself, he doesn't have the Marxist discipline that I bring to my thinking. He was a good guy from the mainstream who has a high moral sense, and he's now deeply troubled by what he did and what has happened. Since the time I filmed him, he's published a long book attacking the entire intelligence community from a very strange point of view, in that he really believes in the intelligence community. He just thinks it should be doing other things and in a more democratic way. I encountered the same thing when I once spent 4 days interviewing a man called Wesley Swearingen, who had been an FBI agent for 25 years. And Swearingen said, you know, FBI was nothing, J. Edgar Hoover was nothing but a blackmailer and a crook. And I was unhappy to be in the FBI under him, and I hated the fact that the FBI was a secret police and a political police, but I love the FBI, and I think we should have an FBI, but I think the FBI should be concerned with crime. And Warren Hinkle, who was an old figure from the 60s who published the magazine Ramparts, was with me, and he said, but listen, Wes Swearingen, don't you think the FBI is so corrupt that there's no way in the world that it could break itself off from political activity and just... And Swearingen firmly believed that we could have a national police force that addressed itself only to criminal matters. I think we could, maybe, but I don't think it can be the FBI, because the FBI's tradition is so sordid, and its tradition is so involved with suppressing our rights as citizens, suppressing our rights under the Bill of Rights, with lying about the Freedom of Information Act, with persecuting people. I'm not afraid to be persecuted because I'm not afraid of the FBI, but persecuting people who are afraid of them, that I don't think the FBI can be reformed. I think it has to be abolished.
What about another person that I was curious about is in your cast of characters, Joseph Buttinger, the man who was the president of the Executive Committee of the American Friends of Vietnam.
You and your audience mustn't think I'm crazy, because although I may be, I don't like to admit it, but I mean, think of the panoply of figures that you have, say, in War and Peace.
Yes.
Well, I mean, my work isn't War of Peace. I mean, I'm an artist, my work is good, but it's not War and Peace. But I like a complicated cast of characters. The world isn't composed of good people and bad people, you know. It's composed of all kinds of people. Now, Buttinger was, for me, a useful person, not a good person. He had an extraordinary knowledge of Vietnam from the most corrupt background. He was one of those liberals from the old Austrian social democratic movement who went to Vietnam and wrote speeches for Ngo Dinh Diem. He worked for the enemy, but then he saw that he knew Ngo Dinh Diem better than any American, and he saw them going crazy in front of him. He describes it, as you've seen in the film, Madame Ngo, mad on power, Ngo himself, mad on himself, and Diem, mad on a kind of misty, ancient feeling of Vietnam, none of them having anything to do with the real world, all of them tightly enclosed like old monarchs, and out of touch with their own people, and on our payroll, on the take. So Buttinger is not a man I like. He's not a man I respect. He's not a man I would want to have dinner with, but he's a man who knew a great deal, so I used him. And I use people of the left and the right, and in that way you get as true a picture as you can, I think, on film of a long piece of history.
Speaking of history, we hear John Foster Dulles speaking about the domino theory, meaning that if Vietnam fell, it would knock over Cambodia, which would knock over Laos, which would knock over Thailand, and so forth. Two kinds of questions. One, Do you believe that he was sincerely committed to that as a viable idea? And has the historical event borne out the theory that we based so much of our activity on?
You know, our foreign policy wasn't only reactionary. It was absolutely, the solid rock of our foreign policy was ignorance. Most of the people in our foreign service do not speak other languages. They do speak French. But they don't even speak German or Italian, let alone Vietnamese, Thai, Cham, or any of the languages of Southeast Asia. So that these people were making, John Foster Dulles was a consummate hypocrite, but the people who were feeding him that information about the domino theory were totally incompetent. They were CIA hacks. The domino theory didn't work. Anybody who knew history would know that the Cambodians were historically the enemies of the Vietnamese, which is what indeed has happened. They would know also that the Vietnamese were historically the enemies of the Chinese. That China was always trying to engulf Vietnam. They would know that that whole part of the world for thousands of years had been struggling, various peoples, various ethnic groups, various languages. That there is some hope for peace in that part of the world, but not as long as we also, of course, are masters of the self-fulfilling prophecies, because we help to make the events happen that we want to have happen. You send enough troops over there, you buy up enough people, you buy a few governors, you buy a few kings, you buy a few governments, and then you can make the bloody thing happen, can't you? So that's really the answer to that.
Near the end of the film, Harry Ashmore quotes Senator Fulbright, speaking about the fact that our nation was suffering from the arrogance of power. Do you believe that after the debacle of Vietnam, that this has been assuaged, or do you think that this is still a virus in the body politic?
Well, I think you'd have to ask President Bonzo or General Plague. I mean, those people have some idea about whether we are still arrogant in our power. I think that we became arrogant with power long before Fulbright sensed it. I think we were arrogant with power about, I would say, for sure, beginning August the 6th, 1945, when the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. At that one explosive moment in history, we were separated from all the rest of the world, because we had it was almost like Greek myth. We had a kind of divine bomb that could destroy the earth, and nobody else had it. And we acquired, we had a fatal, self-destructive, drunken arrogance over that has been the cornerstone of our foreign policy and everything else since that time. I am not anti-American. I'm an American. I live in this country. This is my country. And I am not against America. I want America to change, to get rid of these foul elements that are corrupting what this country should be and the vision that I have of this country, which is not a vision of killing people.
So in that sense, in the Year of the Pig still really has a good deal to say about our situation, going back to the question that I asked you before the film was shown about its relevance.
Well, I like to think that Point of Order about Joseph McCarthy has a great deal to say about the United States today with the Denton Committee coming up. I'm awaiting a subpoena from those people so that I will have a chance once more to undertake experiencing native fascism. And the same thing is true of The Year of the Pig and other films of other people as well as of mine. Of course, films aren't made in beautiful boxes with orchids. They're made about the real world and about faith, hope, aspiration, death. Exactly.
Well, I think that we've all found this very interesting, and I want to thank you so much for talking with us tonight, Dee.
Well, I'm glad to be back in Lincoln and to be here again with you, and particularly again to see students here who are responsive to, I think, the challenges that are before all of us. But primarily the students, because they're the main people who matter in this community.
Thank you.
This program was made possible in part by funds provided by Nebraskans for Public Television.